And a big hello to the good people of St Arnaud district. So it's Graeme Anderson here. Sorry I can't be there in person, but put together just a bit of a short recording of St Arnaud's long-term rainfall record and seasonal forecasting. Okay, now we're just looking at the 3 months from January to March this year. We haven't had much rain in April to add to this, but this is just the current status. I'm going to show a few of these. I'm just looking at a decile map, so I'll explain what decile 1 is, where recent rainfall's been within the driest 10% of years, and decile 10 is where rainfall's been the equivalent of the wettest 10% of years, and then this is average. So you can see for your part of the world it's been largely average for January to March, and a bit drier so far in April. We're still waiting for that autumn break. And this is not a bad site if you haven't seen it before. It's a new soil moisture site with the Bureau of Meteorology, and basically showing here these are the below average or very much below average or above average sites. So you can sort of see your areas around about average at the minute. There's a few drier spots around and a few got some summer thunderstorms. And these here are soil moisture probes. There's a soil moisture probe network that's in, and if you're interested in getting monthly updates on that, just drop an email to Dale Boyd. He can give you add you to that newsletter, which is really in the bank and seeing how our soil moisture profile is travelling. 2015, don't need to tell you guys up there, it's been was pretty dry. So decile 1, so in the driest 10% of years for your part of the world. Interesting though, we don't have to travel too far away. There are a couple of key rainfall events we missed out on last year, so sometimes there's not a lot in it. Really frustrating to watch rain fall over the border and not where you need it. So here's hoping that gets better this year. Also, just again, the 2014 and 15 combined, if we just look at those last 2 years, you can see a new colour popping in here. So for a part of Western Victoria and South Australia there, those 2 dry springs really taken their toll, and that's sort of been the driest 2-year period on record for some. So pretty tough. Prior to that, we can remember water running around everywhere. 2010 and 11, that 2-year period the Bureau has down as the wettest 2-year period in Australia's history, and it wasn't just wet here, it was wet over pretty well all of the continent. So we'll talk a little bit about where did all of that moisture come from. And I guess just going back a bit further from, this is looking at cool season rainfall from April to October, but just looking at this period from 97 through to 2015, and you can see for parts of southern Australia and the area we've been in a bit of a drier phase in the last 15 years compared to the longer term record. So we'll just talk about what the culprit could be. Okay, now here we've got St Arnaud's long-term rainfall record, so thank Dale Gray for crunching this out, but this is the long-term record. You can see here 1881 all the way through to last year, and you can see a lot of variability there. This is millimetres up the side here, so there's some years which are down to close to 200 mils and some years where, over 900, so a lot of variability there. And this line through the middle here is the long-term average, which is pretty much just over 500 millimetres a year. So what do you notice? Well, average rainfall doesn't happen very often, and I guess what we'll talk about is there anything behind, what's the difference between one of these years versus one of these years? And a lot of variability there. You can see the Federation drought there, a run of pretty mongrel years in amongst there. Part of the World War II had a few dry years thrown in together. Sort of probably the odds of things were a bit wetter in those decades there, but then this sort of recent decade we've had a few drier, and most importantly, you've had 4 drier than average thrown in a row, which is not ideal. Now this is that St Arnaud record, but just looking at the summer rainfall, and again long-term average is 87 mil, and you look back to 1881 right through, you can see how wet that summer of 2010-11 was. That was a record breaker, and in fact that was Victoria's wettest summer, broke the old records by about 25%, so very wet. The tropics came down to visit there. And autumn at St Arnaud, a lot of variability there. Long-term average 115 mil. I guess probably just looking at the last sort of 20 years, there's been probably more drier ones. Often when we look at this sort of period from the 60s through to the 80s, we got a good autumn break about every second year, but good autumns have been probably about 1 in every 4 years in the last 20. So we'll talk a little bit about what's going on there. And winter rainfall 168, Lots of variability there, and again, just probably, you had a couple of dry winters in a row, which sometimes isn't too bad so long as you get a decent spring, and but that hasn't been happening. And here's that spring record again, a lot of variability, but you can see, you're on the end of 3, 4, 5 sort of crook springs there, so that's a bit tough. You can see some sort of other few runs of dry springs there, again World War II and back in Federation drought. So here's hoping this spring we'll crack one above the line. And I guess a lot of the seasonal forecasting is all about understanding these core drivers of our rainfall. And I love this picture. Here's Antarctica, and here we are, this part of the world. What makes it wetter in some years and drier in others? Well, here's the key 4 climate drivers, I guess. And to make rainfall down here, we need a good source of tropical moisture coming from somewhere, and that comes from these warm oceans up north. And we've got the Pacific Ocean, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, really important source of moisture for Eastern Australia, and it feeds into the weather events down south, and also to the Indian Ocean Dipole, really important in terms of providing moisture for our weather events down here. And I guess in dry years like last spring and in 2006, in El Nino years, we have less moisture coming out of this part of the world. Less moisture in an El Nino year. The IOD in both those years actually went into its dry phase as well, and that just meant weather events down here for winter and spring couldn't find a moisture source to tap into. When you look at perhaps 2010, that wetter spring, summer, we had a La Nina here, plenty of moisture coming in from this area, and the IOD was also in its wet phase. So when they can either be helpful or not helpful, and then as to whose farm it turns up on, it's really to do with these weather events and where they line up. So I guess part of the seasonal forecasting is just about what's the background conditions for how these oceans are setting up, and we'll talk about what they're up to for this year. One of the reasons forecasters look at soil sea surface temperature maps. This is just looking at an anomaly map. These colours here are where an area of ocean might be 2 degrees warmer than its long-term average. This area might be where ocean's cooler than its long-term average. And you can see along here, this is back in September 2006, warm out here in the Eastern Pacific and El Nino out there, lots of cloud and everything out happening that way. And over in this important area for Australia, these oceans, which are often feeding the moisture in, you can see they're cooler than average. And when they're set up like that, there's actually they're in a less helpful mood. More of the moisture is not normally where that warmer seas are. So that's what a drier pattern looks like. And what I want you to do is just have a look at this area here and see if you notice any difference when we move to the spring of 2010. See if you notice any difference. Well, there you have it. That's the October 2010 big La Nina in the Pacific. All the warmer water than average was over in our part of the world, and it just meant that a lot of extra cloud cover and moisture to feed into those weather events down south. And it's the winter springs when that has the main impact here. So seasonal forecasting is really just giving a bit of a heads up of how they're lining up from one year. And just looking at, this is St Arnaud's rainfall in October. August to October rainfall in those previous 32 El Nino episodes that we've had, and this is just looking at what's happened at St Arnaud. Now you can see it's always drier, or usually drier, in Eastern Australia, not always, but that's the result from 12 El Ninos there. But when we look at St Arnaud's August-October rainfall, rather than just a third of those springs being decile 1 to 3, actually it's bit over 2 out of 3 of those springs were dry. You can see that there was still the odd El Nino where it was average or wetter, but it definitely increases the chance of dry, and I guess that's largely responsible for last year. And I guess when you look at St Arnaud in La Nina years, when there's extra moisture coming out of the Pacific, feeding into our weather patterns, you can see that the chances of a dry year in La Nina are certainly reduced. Rather than a third of years being dry, it's sort of down to 12%. So that's so its fingerprints are there, but it doesn't guarantee one or the other. It just changes the odds. Now looking at Indian Ocean Dipole, when the IOD is in its drier phase, there's a sort of less moisture and it's being less helpful to us down this part of the world. And when we look at St Arnaud's record and that August-October rainfall, again, rather than just a third of those years being dry, it doubles the chance of a dry spring. Now, there's still a third of years are okay, and it just means there's some moisture coming in from somewhere else. What's interesting, though, is when the IOD is in its wetter phase, quite a strong signal for wetter springs down this way, and you can see for St Arnaud it's only ever been wet or average in IOD negative years. So fingers crossed, we're due for one of those soon. So here's hoping it might be this year. And just one thing, analogy I want to make, that when it comes to seasonal forecasts, autumn is a less predictable time of year, and usually our oceans are a bit like our footy teams. They're just still setting themselves up for the year ahead. But once we get to sort of May, June, July, there's a bit more of a lead as to how your footy team's going to be performing, and whether they're in the top four or the bottom four. And it's same too for those oceans. Forecasters have a better idea of which way those oceans are going to zig into either wetter phase or dry phase, or just stay normal. And we provide commentary on that, and I guess the Break newsletter put out by Dale Gray, that's fantastic commentary for Victorian farmers. And also, and so if you're wanting that, just drop an email to the Break. It's free. There's monthly updates there, also YouTube updates, and also that soil moisture updates on the soil probes. Dale Boyd can actually provide free newsletters on that too, so they're well worth tapping in if you haven't seen them already. Now, Dale Gray does a great job on the fast break, and here's a table that's just want to explain to farmers because it's pretty useful. And it's basically looking at the different forecast models from across the world. So this is the European model, the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia's model, the Japanese, US, NASA, another Japanese, UK, all of these excellent models looking at what's their seasonal forecast for rainfall. And he looks at them. These are all the March runs for April, May, June, and they sort of talk about, well, what are the things happening in the Pacific, on the Indian Ocean, and also just rainfall from our point of view. So Dale looks at these and looks at the part of Victoria, and you can see here there's sort of a mixture there of average or a few with a slightly wetter signal on them for this year. So stay tuned of that. That's worth keeping an eye on, especially how these tables change from one month to the next. And interesting there for the July, August, September, again a couple there with wetter, a couple with dry. Just important to watch these over the coming months of how they change. Last year in sort of July, August, more than half of these models had that dry signal. So these seasonal forecasts can give a bit of an idea about whether things are out there just being normal, or whether it's one of those higher risks, or whether it might be one of those years where there's a bit more moisture blowing around our part of the world. Now, we had the big El Nino last year, and a lot of people ask, so what's typically followed El Ninos in this district? So let's have a quick look at that. And here's the rainfall record for St Arnaud, but these are the individual El Nino years for St Arnaud, and you can see there. And what's been printed here is the year following those El Ninos. So these are all the years after El Ninos from that St Arnaud rainfall record, and Dale Gray's crunched these figures. So I guess one thing to note over here, this is that monthly rainfall for those years, and you can see here that these are the blue indicates decile 8, 9, 10 years for April to October rainfall. That's average years, and there were a few dry ones in there as well. And I think often we look at the 82 drought, Big El Nino, and think that usually it's followed up by a good break. And you see in that year, March, there was 136 mil there. What a start to the season that would have been. But that doesn't always typically happen. And we can say, look at the 2006 El Nino, and then the next year, 2007, that was one of those dry years. So a wet year is not guaranteed, but certainly these odds over here look better than what we were facing last year when we were heading into El Nino territory. So fingers crossed. And what I'd probably have a look at is that probably for the next few months, it's really going to be around if the Indian Ocean heads into its ID negative phase or not, or whether a La Nina turns up. That's sort of what we'll be keeping an eye on to see if the end of the season might be a bit better this year. Now, what I've been talking about is largely just good old-fashioned variability and how we read the play from one year to the next. But is there anything different going on that hasn't happened in the past? Well, I guess one thing has just been, this is temperature records for Victoria. That's summer temperatures going back to 1910, autumn temperatures, winter and max. And I guess you can look at that and see quite a bit of variability, but certainly the last decade's been a bit warmer. And the one thing I'll just point out is springs. In the last 10 years, we've had probably 6 or 7 springs that have been between 1.5 and 3 degrees warmer than average. So I guess that fits with what the Bureau have been telling us about summer's probably getting a bit bigger and just turning up a bit earlier in spring and hanging around in autumn a bit longer. So that's one thing that's a little bit different. The other thing is probably around frost. There's some these bluer areas are areas where spring or late frosts have been a bit more of an issue of late, and some really good work happening locally with James Nuttall at Horsham there, just really trying to make sense of that, and also a lot of great work through GODC and others looking at different strategies for dealing with that. And I guess the culprit for that is largely around the pressure pattern over southern Australia, that you can see since 1950 the pressure goes up and down from one year to the next, and this is looking at April to October pressure. But you can also see, the El Nino 67, 68 and the 82 El Nino. Those El Nino years are when there's a higher pressure over Australia, the 97, 98 El Nino, the 06 El Nino, and then last year's El Nino. So there's variability there, but one of the things I guess they're just picking up is the pressure pattern just slightly being a bit stronger here, and that pressure pattern does tend to mean that some of our cooler season rainfall gets squeezed a bit further south a bit more often, and also when some of those highs hang around, that's sort of conducive for some of that sort of frostier conditions as well. So that's part of what's going on that might be a little bit different to what we've seen in the past. And I guess some recent work by the Australian AGIC just sort of looked at, since 2000, a lot of our sort of rainfall seasons, if anything, just nudged a bit further south, which I guess fits with what a lot of farmers have noticed. Right, so from one year to the next, we never know what the weather's going to throw at us, but it has been amazing, really, when you think of the last few years, what a great job farmers and agriculture have done to deal with that variability. And I'm pretty amazed at how much grain people grow per millimetre of rainfall these years, and all because of all these improvements, the new technologies and modern equipment farmers are using, better genetics and systems, are all really helping us to get more out of the rain that does fall. Also, we've got improved farm and regional infrastructure like on-farm storage, water systems, photo communications. All of those things are helping us, and also we've got these sort of growing global markets and connection to markets and value adding, which are all good. Doesn't guarantee we get paid more for them, and that's why it's really critical to have good business management, which can really deal with those variable years and variable income, which is all a part of modern farming, and people have been doing a terrific job at managing that. Farm plans, minimum till. A lot of people remember all of the dust blowing around in the 82 drought, and how we've done such a great job at reducing that from these previous run of dry years, and that's just because of all of those min-tilled soil cover, really important things, and the use of all of these sort of modern technologies, managing soil moisture, keeping weed free over summer, soil moisture probes. All those things are really it's a credit to everyone who's applying all of that. And agriculture's always been dealing with a lot of change, and I guess I've just put down here just some of my observations about how a lot of farms across Victoria deal with that change. And it's interesting that we're not just talking about whether it's changing markets or changing weather patterns or changing technologies. I think these are the sort of changes that have always been there as part of agriculture, and there's these first decisions, which are things that we just sort of change as we're going through them. Then sometimes there's need for some bigger decisions, which are usually a bit more expensive or a bit harder or take a bit more thinking through, and they're things about what do we do if things are a bit drier a bit more often, or how do we handle this or change the enterprise mix or the business system a bit more. And then there's some tougher decisions too, which is really about thinking harder about what if something's not working for you, what is it that's under your control that you can change so that you're enjoying your lot in agriculture. And I'm pretty sure these things have always been there as options in agriculture, and agriculture's always been throwing us plenty of challenges over the years. I think the main thing is that you're working through and doing the changes that are right for you. So good luck with the year ahead, and hope that was of some use. If you want to get any more information or subscribe, just send an email to the break, and all the best for the year ahead.